Greetings, metalheads, and welcome to No Nonsense Metal Reviews. I'm George, and today I'm back with another album ranking. This time, I'm going to be ranking, of course, entirely based on my own opinion, but ranking the full length studio catalogue of grindcore turned death metal, melodic death metal, death and roll, whatever subgenre they happen to be delving into at the time. Outright legends, the mighty Carcass. From Liverpool, England, founded in around 1986. We've got 7 full-length studio albums in their catalogue. There's also a few EPs and compilations and things like that, but we're just going to be focusing on those full-length studio albums today. Now, Carcass, for me, are an all-time favourite in terms of extreme metal. They really were one of the first extreme metal bands that I actually really got into. And it was with the second full-length album, the Symphonies of Sickness album. And I think I stumbled upon it by chance. And I believe, I can't remember the year, but it was seeing Carcass as the headliner on a Damnation Festival lineup poster. And it was the logo that drew me in. And I thought, okay, this looks like a pretty extreme logo. Delve in, purchase that album, Symphonies of Sickness album, and I was absolutely stunned. I had no idea what I was listening to. It was I think one of the most extreme things I had heard to date, and I had not a clue what to do with it. It was like next level stuff. And considering that I was already a big fan of bands like Slipknot, for example, big gateway bands like that, the far more accessible bands, this was next level brutality. Absolutely disgusting stuff that it was. Alongside, I think it was sort of Napalm Death and Cannibal Corpse. They were the kind of the bands that got me into death metal, or I guess I'm just going to term it the extreme end of the metal spectrum. Because, of course, Napalm Death, Carcass, are they grindcore? Are they death metal? There's a little bit of ambiguity there. But Carcass, 7 full-length studio albums. All of them, I will say, all of them are great albums. I love all of them. Just because number 7 is at the bottom of my list doesn't mean that it's not a great album, doesn't mean that I don't like it. It just means that there's other albums in the catalogue that I enjoy a little bit more. And of course, do bear in mind, it's entirely my own opinion. So you may disagree, you may think one album, that I hold in higher regard is actually your least favourite, or you don't think it's as good as ones that are further down my list. That's fine. All entitled to our own opinion, of course. And we're all friends here. This is all metal. We're all brethren of the metal faith together. So we're going to kick off with album number 7. And for me, it's the debut album from 1988. This is Reek of Putrefaction. Of course, this is the censored album cover. The original album cover, in all of its disgusting glory, is housed inside. And like I say, even though this album is at number 7 for me, it doesn't mean that I don't enjoy it. For a long time, I didn't really enjoy it, I will admit. For a long time, I totally overlooked it because it's just obscenely disgusting. And, in terms of quality, it's very, very low quality. It's not very polished or squeaky clean. Having said that, over the years, on frequent revisits, if you like, it has steadily grown on me. And actually, I feel like I've grown to appreciate Reek of Putrefaction a little bit more over time. I mean, it is an absolutely disgusting album. It sounds disgusting. It looks disgusting. And with track titles like some of these, Regurgitation of Giblets, Nice. There's loads of just absolutely vulgar song titles there. But of course, this is the interesting question. Is it grindcore? Is it gore grind, death metal? Don't know. That's a question for another time. But I would say that it's certainly death metal, or certainly extreme. There are some good tracks on this album. Kicking off with Genital Grinder, which is a track, an intro piece that has featured in their live set, certainly on a couple of the occasions that I've seen them. We've got Processified. I can never pronounce that one. Track number 4, brackets Rotten to the Gore. That is a solid track. Really nasty. The guitar tone that really stands out for being just utterly putrid. We've got Festa Day is a short grinding little piece there. We've got Fermenting Innards, Feast on Dismembered Carnage. Yeah, it's disgusting, but actually it's pretty gruesome stuff. You can hear, listening to this album, where those bands years down the line, like General Surgery or Exhumed, you can hear exactly where they're coming from and where the inspiration happens to lie. So number 7 for me, the putrid debut album, Reek of Putrefaction. So, undergoing a massive stylistic change, and that's the real thing that stands out with Carcass's studio albums, is just how different each album sounds. I think the most similar in sound and nature is actually the most recent too, but it's from the Reek of Putrefaction, through Symphonies, through Necroticism, they all sound distinctly different. This isn't a Motorhead situation where you can pretty much guarantee what the next album's going to sound like. And it's a huge leap between Reek of Putrefaction and what is probably their most commercial, or I guess easily digestible sounding album. This is Swan Song. This is 1996, this album, I believe. 95, 96. I think that this is a good album. I personally consider this to be a bit of an underrated album because it's a death and roll album, definitely. It's not as heavy, it's not as grotesque and extreme as the previous albums. There are some relatively palatable rock and roll death metal songs here, such as Keep On Rotting in the Free World, Tomorrow Belongs to Nobody. There are some heavier moments in the form of Black Star, for example, Room 101, Polarized. We've got Rock the Vote, Don't Believe a Word. There's some good stuff here. You know, they might not be as heavy as some of the former albums and some of the former songs and the real standouts, but that said, it's still a really solid album. I think there's some enjoyable stuff here. That's why number 6 for me is Swan Song, an underrated anomaly. This was the album that kind of preceded the massive hiatus. Carcass disappeared for about 17 years, I think. Certainly in terms of studio time, studio albums, there were some live appearances and stuff, I think, in that time. But an interesting, well, a very fitting title, in fact, the Swan Song before a massive hiatus of about 17 years. So number 6 for me is Swan Song. Number 5 is probably the biggest album in terms of the most notoriety and the biggest success. This is Heartwork. This was a couple of years before that, I think, 1993. A very good album. A melodic death metal benchmark album. And for a long time, this was one of my favourite Carcass albums. But interestingly, revisiting all of these albums for the purpose of doing this album ranking, it's steadily been demoted compared to some of the other albums I've just been enjoying a lot more over time. But that said, this is start to finish full of absolute classics. This is a fantastic album. Kicks off with an all-time live fan favourite in the form of Buried Dreams. We've got the massive Carnal Forge, which is another sort of fan favourite and live favourite. No Love Lost with its huge melodic grooves there. The fantastic Heartwork title track with some of the beastliest guitar work, beastly riffs on this whole album. It's seriously a solid track. Then we've got Embodiment, one of the heaviest moments, alongside this Mortal Coil. Elsewhere, there are some other brilliant tracks, maybe a little bit more underrated. We've got Doctrinal Expletives and Death Certificate. this bonus tracks version. I won't really mention those too much, but just the solid bulk of the album is really strong. Lots of massive riffs. Jeff Walker, a great iconic vocalist in terms of extreme metal and being an extreme metal frontman, does a great job here. Prominent bass tone as well. I think the real standout is always going to be the absolutely fantastic and hugely underrated guitar work of the great Bill Steer. I think that guy is a phenomenal guitarist, and if you have ever had the pleasure, or do ever have the pleasure, of seeing Carcass live, I've seen them I think 3 times now. Absolutely phenomenal guitarist. Of course, you've got Michael Amott present in the band at this point as well, or Amott, founding member, guitar hero, and all-round legend. Kind of famous for a little band called Arch Enemy primarily, but this album features some fantastic guitar work from the great Mike as well. All round, a really well-written album, well-structured, it's consistent, it is heavy, it's not as heavy and extreme as the albums that came before it, but just taking tracks like Buried Dreams, No Love Lost, This Mortal Coil, even Blind Leading the Blind, really solid stuff. So number 5 for me is the melodic death metal benchmark point in Carcass's catalogue. It's Hard Work. Solid album. So number 4. Number 4 for me is the album that actually exposed me to Carcass. The first album of Carcass's that I actually owned. I think this is a disgusting album. It's absolutely putrid. It's the guitar tone and that bass, that rumbling brown noise bass tone, the disgusting vocal duets of Bill and Jeff. But it's an absolute benchmark in terms of putrid, old school, gore, grind, death metal. I would consider this to be a death metal album, and it's absolutely merciless. It's so nasty. It's that guitar tone, and certainly on tracks like the opening track, The Reek of Putrefaction, Exhumed to Consume, the second track there, is, again, that's a bit of a fan favourite, a bit of a live favourite, a disgusting track, probably one of the most covered Carcass songs or extreme metal songs, definitely. Excoriating Abdominal Emanation. The titles of these songs are still pretty wordy and gross, but that contains an absolute beast of a riff. Crushing stuff. The absolutely excellent Ruptured in Purulence. The intro of that track alone is absolutely fantastic. It's the way that the bass rolls and rumbling, and then we get that riff come in, just cuts straight in, and it's like a sledgehammer to the freaking skull. Excellent stuff. Elsewhere, we've got some other great tracks in the form of Embryonic Necropsy and Devourment. I should think that that's probably inspired quite a few extreme metal band names over time. Swarming Vulgar Mass of Infected Virulency. Excellent Slash Dementia and Crepitating Bowel Erosion as well. Absolutely disgusting stuff. But I would say that honestly, this is one of the most disgusting sounding death metal albums that I've ever heard. I think that it's so nasty. It's like metal brown noise. It's the sound of decay. And it really is a symphony of utter sickness. But a solid one. This is album number 2, of course, from 1990, I believe. Can't quite recall the... Actually, I think it was 1989. I think that Reek of Putrefaction was 88. Then we had Symphony of Sickness in 89. So they were progressing a lot in quite a short period of time there. But a great album. If you are looking for some utterly disgusting death metal, then this is something you need to check out. Symphonies of Sickness, album number 4 in my ranking. So now it gets really difficult and also surprising, because at number 3, Torn Arteries from 2021. This is the most recent album. This is a fantastic album, and I didn't necessarily connect with it straight away, I have to say. But over time, subsequent revisits, subsequent re-listens, it has absolutely rocketed in my estimations, past all four of these other brilliant albums, right up to that number 3 spot. And it is a brilliant album. Right across the board, the musicianship, vocals is fantastic. The production on this album is really good. It's such a well-produced album. It sounds great. It's different as well. But again, like I mentioned earlier, Carcass, they don't sound the same 2 albums in a row. There is distinct differences there. But I'll show this awesome, crazy artwork here. It's a really solid album. It's melodic death metal, but it's got more of that kind of old school death metal aggression there. Just say, by this point we have Dan Wilding on drums and vocals, Jeff alongside Jeff and Bill. So what is it that's so special about Torn Arteries? Well, other than having awesome artwork, I think that's so cool, that's so niche. And it's just an unconventional album cover. That's not a normal Carcass album cover. But what's so special about this is it's just start to finish full of tracks containing brilliant melodicism, really intricate and fantastic guitar work, massively heavy riffs, decent amount of chug. We've got blast beats there. We've got it all. We've got all the flavors. This is almost like a complete medley of Carcass and all the different sounds and styles that they have adopted over their career. Kick off with Torn Arteries, the title track, which is absolutely brutal. Some massive riffs there. We've got the Dance of Istab. Don't know if you actually pronounce it like that, but Psycho Pomp and Circumstance March number 1 in B. It's fantastic. We've got an absolute thrasher in the form of Eleanor Rigby Mortis. Eleanor Rigor Mortis, rather. Absolutely brilliant track. Like I say, it's an absolute thrasher. Kicks off with some serious thrash riffing from Bill. The Devil Rides Out is an epic number. The absolutely grand and bonkers, proggy, mental craziness of flesh-ripping Sonic Torment Limited. Bonkers. But just start to finish, this is a really solid album. There's no weak tracks here. All of them are so well written and structured. Right down to Wake Up and Smell the Carcass, with its kind of like death and roll vibes. It's rock and roll pomp. And then we've got the closing track, The Scythe's Remorseless Swing, which again, that's a grand way to close an album, and a really heavy moment at that. So number 3 for me, the most recent album, Torn Arteries, a Carcass, an incarnation of Carcass at their absolute best, incorporating all the sounds and styles that they've picked up and adopted and flirted with along the way. So, what could possibly beat that? I've been bigging up Torn Arteries here. What could beat it? Well, a number 2 for me is Necroticism. I always mispronounce that, but Descanting the Insalubrious. This album is where Carcass was starting to make a little bit of a change. We've now got Michael Amott in the band by this point. They're changing from Symphonies of Sickness, outright gruesome death, into melodic death metal. There's some absolute belters on here. Still sounds nasty, still sounds absolutely dirgy and putrid, but at the same time we're starting to get some hugely crushing, chugging riffs. Tracks like the opening track, In Propagation, second track, Corporal Jigsaw Quandary, with its absolutely fantastic rhythmic, groovy, bulldoze riffs there. It's a bit of a live favourite, in fact. Symposium of Sickness, Incarnated Solvent Abuse, another regularly appearing live fan favourite there. Absolutely stunning. I really do love this album, right up to the last tracks there. Forensic Clinicism, the Sanguine Article. Fantastic. So it's a putrid sounding album, definitely. I think that there's obviously a lot of influence at this time. I think this was 1991, yeah. So there's a lot of influence of what's happening elsewhere in the death metal world. Maybe a little bit of a influence from the American death metal scene. There's definitely a change here, but I would say that this is a benchmark again. Certainly in terms of old school death metal, this is a high point. This is a fantastic album. Some cracking tracks here. Carcass, not at their nastiest sounding, but certainly this sounds pretty damn grotesque here. Necroticism, a fantastic album. Tracks that you definitely need to check out. I do love that opening track, In Propagation, with its kind of use of samples at the intro. And it's got a really sinister vibe to this whole album. It sounds very unnerving and just generally grotesque. But that's a great opening track. Corporal Jigsaw Quandary and Incarnated Solvent Abuse, of course. Brilliant classic Carcass tracks, but I particularly enjoy Pedigree Butchery as well. It's just the guitar work. Massive freaking riffs. Absolutely delightful. Start to finish, superb album. So number 2 for me, Necroticism. The tricky third album. Just saw the band going from strength to strength. So that leaves one album. At number 1, it's the album that got me really hooked on Carcass in this lovely, shiny form. This is the comeback album from 2013. This is Surgical Steel. Now, I would say this is the album that got me into Carcass in a big way, although the first album that I had actually heard was Symphonies of Sickness. Didn't really know what to do with that. It was actually when I then heard the single Captive Bolt Pistol, which I think that was the lead single, kind of preceding the album but marking their comeback. I think it was like announced at the same time as some live dates in London, if I remember, at the Underworld. But that track, that did it. It was like, whoa, this is some of the freshest but nastiest but just chunkiest death metal that I've heard, certainly by that point. And it snowballed from there. I picked this up and I have listened to it so many times. I saw them on this tour, or actually I think it was the Defenders of the Faith tour, alongside Amon Amarth in London. And I remember reviewing this album on the actual blogger page, No Nonsense Metal Review page, decades ago now. It feels like about 15 years. No, not quite. But it feels like a very, very long time ago. But I absolutely was gushing over this album, and I still absolutely love it to this day. That intro of 1985, the way that kind of builds the suspense, and then we're into Thrasher's Abattoir, short, sharp thrashing number. Then we've got Cadaver Pouch Conveyor System. Excellent stuff. Just those fantastic riffs. Guitar work's fantastic. Of course, we haven't got Michael in the band anymore, but Bill, such a phenomenal guitarist. A Congealed Clot of Blood, Master Butcher's Apron. One of my personal favourites and one of the best titles for a track on any Carcass album. Non-compliance to ASTM F89912 standard. Then we've got the succession of the granulating Dark Satanic Mills. Very melodic, very heavy, very groovy, and unfit for human consumption. Grinding number. Those kind of big singles. I think they were singles as well. My favourite track on the album has to be 316L Grade Surgical Steel, closest that we get to a title track. And actually it was brilliant to hear the live version of that on the most recent Carcass UK tour. Then we close the main album with Mount of Execution, which is a fantastic, grand way to close the album. A heavy metal number in a lot of ways, with a truly barbarically groovy riff outro. Absolutely fantastic. Just start to finish, I adore this album. As I say, it was the one that really, really ignited my passion for Carcass, and it's the one that I have always gone back to the most often. I've always frequented this one. Whenever I think, fancy a little bit of Carcass, it's generally this, Surgical Steel, or Necroticism that I'm reaching for. But in terms of just the stunning musicianship, Fantastic production. Of course, it's mixed and mastered by Andy Sneap and produced by Colin Richardson. Some pretty talented names behind the controls there, but the brilliant production, the brilliant songwriting, it just sounds fantastic. So that for me is number one, my favourite Carcass album, Surgical Steel. So just to recap in ascending order, number 7 for me was Reek of Putrefaction, the debut album from '88. Then we've got the 1996 album Swan Song, a death and roll classic at number 6 for me. Number 5, probably the biggest album. Well, certainly it's got a reputation, it's got a legacy, but at number 5 we've got Heartwork. Number 4, the absolutely revolting Symphonies of Sickness. Number 3, the stunning Torn Arteries. Number 2, Necroticism. Fantastic. Not really sure what, I've never been able to figure out what is going on with that album cover, but freaking great. And number 1, the mighty Surgical Steel. Absolutely love it. So my friends, what are your thoughts on my album ranking? How would you rank the catalogue of Carcass? Feel free to share your thoughts on this one. Feel free to get some dialogue and discussion going. But do remember, we're all entitled to our own opinions and we're all friends here. We're all brethren of the metal. So my friends, a big thank you for watching. Please do feel free to like, subscribe, comment, share, whatever. Really appreciate all the support that you give me, continued support. So thank you very much to everyone. Check back soon as well for more reviews, more rankings, more talk of all good heavy things. But take care of yourselves, my friends, and until next time, stay heavy.